The U.S. Supreme Court handed down two key decisions on presidential power and the firing of people from government agencies. Justices ruled that President Trump does not have the constitutional authority to fire Lisa Cook, a governor from the Federal Reserve Board.
But the court backed the president's power to terminate Rebecca Slaughter, a Democratic appointee to the Federal Trade Commission. This ruling grants more presidential power over federal agencies that are considered independent. It overturns 90 years of precedent. CNN Chief Legal Affairs Correspondent Paula Reed is right outside the Supreme Court. So, Paula, walk us through the significance of these decisions today.
Pamela, these are such incredibly significant decisions. In many ways, these will be some of the defining opinions of the Roberts Court because they get to this question that has been hanging over the second Trump term, which is, are there any limits to his ability to fire federal officials? And here they give us some insight. While President Trump and his lawyers believe in something called a unitary executive theory and that the executives should be able to fire anyone they want, any way they want, here the justices put a few limits on that. In the one case, they ruled, and it's a really interesting group that was in this majority opinion. It's Chief Justice John Roberts, Justice Kavanaugh, and the three liberals all ruled that he cannot fire an official in the Federal Reserve without going through a process, giving that individual an opportunity to respond, that there are some limits on his power when it comes to firing officials at that agency. Now, that is one that has, of course, always been recognized as being independent of the White House. But in a separate case, when it comes to an employee at the Federal Trade Commission, that he does have the power to fire that individual because that is within the executive branch. And again, this is a significant decision because it's sort of drawing out the contours of the extent of his power to try to reshape the federal government through these mass firings. Now, President Trump wasn't clear how he was going to react to these decisions, and it's been a pretty mixed day for him overall at the court, but he described this as, quote, a big win.
I want to bring in our chief Supreme Court analyst, Joan Biskupic, right now. Joan, like Pamela, Paula, you were inside the court when these decisions came down. Give us a little sense of how that felt.
Sure, Wolf. It's good to see you. The most important thing the justices did today was in the case involving Rebecca Slaughter of the Federal Trade Commission. Chief Justice John Roberts and the conservative majority used that decision to roll back nearly a century of legal policy about the president's power to remove the heads of regulatory agencies. Now, in some ways, this is going to sound kind of dry and arcane, but regulatory agencies are so important for how Americans live their lives. They cover rules for, medical, health, nuclear power. In this case, it's the Federal Trade Commission that was at issue, and we're talking about, safeguarding consumer practices, antitrust issues. So that gives you a sense of all that's at stake. But this court, for many, many years, has really not appreciated the congressional power to set these up and set up independent heads that the president can only remove for what's called for cause. That would be if somebody was actually found guilty of some sort of malfeasance or ineffectiveness in office. And that's what happened to Rebecca Slaughter. She was an appointee who had many more years left on her term, but President Trump, when he came into office, said he wanted to remove her. He wanted the power to do that. And the Supreme Court has used that case to say, yes, President Trump can remove Rebecca Slaughter, even though her term's not up, a Democratic appointee, and he can do that at the multitude of other independent agencies that at one point, as I said, Congress had set up to be independent, to not be under the pressure of the president. That was a 6-3 decision, and after the chief, who has had a special project here in trying to give the president much more robust power to not just hire people, but to fire. Justice Sotomayor then read her dissent from the bench, and she said, this can go in one of two directions. This can give, it can give the president more power, and maybe he would be more accountable, or it could lead to chaos. And she looked up at the spectators and she said something to the effect, I can guess at which way it will go. Maybe you can too. So, Wolf, a dramatic case today. It doesn't apply to the Federal Reserve, as we saw with the Lisa Cook one, but it applies to a multitude of other agencies who perform a lot of safeguard functions across the country. Wolf.
All right, Joan Biskupic, thank you very, very much, Paul.
I want to go over to Paula Reed now because there was another big ruling today where justices rejected a Republican challenge to a Mississippi law that allows the counting of some mail-in ballots days after Election Day. So it's certainly a blow to President Trump and his efforts, Paula, to reduce mail-in voting ahead of the midterm elections.
That's exactly right. And Pamela, I really do think this is one of the biggest cases of the term. And it's notable that it came out against the Trump administration because they've been arguing that if the law says that the election has to be held the Tuesday after the first Monday in November, ballots cannot be counted if they come in after that. And this was sort of a test case. If they were able to succeed here and limit those ballots from being counted, it was expected that they could potentially go on to challenge other forms of voting, not exactly on Election Day, in-person voting, those kinds of things. So it's notable here that they lost, and the state of Mississippi, which does allow the counting of mail-in ballots if they arrive after Election Day, as long as they are postmarked by Election Day, that state won, because this is something that is also done in roughly a dozen other states. So this is a really significant case because we were watching this closely to see if the Trump administration prevailed in this case, where else could they try to go to limit those voting opportunities? So this is a significant loss for the Trump Justice Department.
There was also something else that happened at the High Court this morning. The Supreme Court declining to hear President Trump's appeal in the E. Jean Carroll sexual abuse case. So what does this mean for the president?
Well, this means that the one of two E. Jean Carroll cases is over, right? There were two verdicts people will remember for defamation, and one of the cases involved alleged sexual assault. The verdict that came out for $5 million has now been upheld. It's over. Donald Trump has to pay E. Jean Carroll $5 million because the Supreme Court declined to take the case. They had actually postponed their decision whether they would take it or not for something like 13 or 14 or 15 times. And then today they said, we are not taking the case. Not surprising. It doesn't have a real constitutional dimension. Therefore, the lower court ruling and the verdict, the $5 million verdict, stands. Donald Trump has to pay that to E. Jean Carroll. We still don't know what's going to happen with the other case, which resulted in the $80 million verdict. That's still going through the appeals process. But Donald Trump does now have to, like it or not, he has to cut a check to E. Jean Carroll. There's nothing he can do about it.
We have had quite a number of announcements in just the past hour. I want to turn first, though, to perhaps the biggest one, which is the court's decision on the Federal Reserve and Lisa Cook, certainly one of the biggest ones. So what we have here is SCOTUS rejecting President Donald Trump's attempt to immediately fire Lisa Cook, but in a separate ruling, actually expanding the president's power to fire officials, overturning here nearly a century-old precedent. So, look, Ankush, Lisa Cook aside here, is this in essence an expansion of the president's powers?
Oh, yes, this is an extraordinary expansion of the president's powers. And I would flip the order of how I think about these cases. I would start with the case involving the Federal Trade Commissioner, because that basically stands now for the proposition that a 90-year-old case that allowed for independent agencies to be created by Congress has been overruled. And the president now has wide-ranging power, it seems, to fire appointees of these independent, what were supposed to be independent bodies, at will. And so this was how the American regulatory state has been structured for many, many years. Republicans and conservatives have wanted to overturn that structure for decades. So this is a major, major victory for the Republican Party, their policy agenda, their anti-deregulatory agenda, and conservative legal activists. The Lisa Cook case represents what I would describe as an exception to that extraordinarily broad power that they've now given Trump. But it's a narrow exception. It appears to apply just to the Federal Reserve. The Supreme Court conservatives claim that this distinction is based on the history of the Constitution. I don't find that credible. I think this was largely driven by policy considerations and the extreme chaos that a ruling that permitted President Trump to fire Federal Reserve members would have created. I think it's more a practical ruling than a legal philosophical ruling, which is a problem, but I think it helps to explain the distinction and the outcomes.
Yeah, and on Lisa Cook, I mean, the Supreme Court said they're not letting the president proceed with removing her from the Federal Reserve, but they did say that the case might go back to a lower court for due process. So does that mean this could be set to continue? It's not yet a done deal.
It could be set to continue unless the Trump administration backs off of this. And quite a bit has changed in terms of the president's interest in the Federal Reserve since he was able to appoint Kevin Borsch as the new chair. But you're correct. The way that the decision comes out, it says basically that there's some position in between what the government and Lisa Cook had argued that they say, that the court concludes and says, well, there has to be some sort of notice and hearing provided if the president wants to proceed to fire a Federal Reserve member like this. It can't just be nothing. So whether and to what extent it goes back and then moves forward for more proceedings really depends on whether the Trump administration insists on continuing with this effort, or maybe they just back off because they have gotten a major victory in the FTC case.
Yeah. Let's turn to the announcement on mail-in voting. That decision, something of a major blow to President Trump, who we know has been dogged in his targeting of mail-in voting. What did you make of that ruling? And just give us the sort of broader context of, how we've got here.
Yeah, I agree with you that it was a bit of a surprise. And it is a bit of a repudiation to Trump's effort to really clamp down on mail-in voting. But I do think it makes sense to think of this decision as it comes against the broader backdrop of the Supreme Court's rulings in the areas of voting rights and redistricting. Because within this same term, we have seen the conservatives, the Republican appointees on the Supreme Court, dramatically water down protections against discrimination in our voting rights areas and in redistricting areas. And mail-in balloting, actually, Trump is a bit of an outlier. The Republican Party as an institution is either agnostic or in favor of mail-in voting, particularly given the composition of their voters and the aging nature of their voters. So this is maybe a repudiation of Trump, but I think this is probably where the Republican Party wanted the case to come out.